That room glowed with light every night, yet no one ever heard a single laugh. The Halden estate rose from the frozen outskirts of Westchester like a ship stranded in a sea of white. Acres of snow lay hushed, broken only by the skeletal branches of elms that rattled when the wind sharpened. The house itself was grand but austere, a monument of glass and stone designed to impress investors rather than to cradle a family. Yet on winter nights, one thing gave the mansion a strange, almost haunting beauty. A square of yellow light burning from a second-floor window. It belonged to Clara Halden, the 10-year-old daughter of George Halden. Behind that window she lived, or, some whispered, merely existed. For more than a year, no laughter, no music, no voice had been heard from within. Clara had fallen silent the day her mother, Evelyn, died in a helicopter accident over the Hudson. The tragedy was sudden, merciless. Evelyn had been George's opposite, gentle where he was severe, imaginative where he was practical. On the day of the funeral, Clara stood small and still beside her father, clutching a sketchbook with knuckles pale against the leather cover. Her dark hair stuck to her cheeks in the snowfall, but her eyes did not spill a single tear. Some said that children who cannot cry are not without sorrow, but bear sorrow so immense it seals them in silence. And so it was with Clara. George Halden had once commanded boardrooms with a voice that cut through hesitation like a blade. He was the man who, in his 30s, wagered $1 billion on a collapsing market and emerged richer than the banks themselves. Newspapers called him the Ice King. Competitors cursed his cunning, yet secretly admired his brilliance. Now, in his 60s, he faced the one problem his intellect could not solve: his child. He had grown up believing the world was governed by solvable equations, like Newton's 3 laws of motion. For every action, a reaction; every force, a counterforce. But in Clara's silence, there was no reaction, no response, only a void that mocked his certainty. He summoned psychiatrists from Harvard, pediatric neurologists from Johns Hopkins, therapists with shining resumes and soft, practiced voices. They brought diagnoses, bottles of pills, diagrams of neural circuits. Clara rejected them all. She turned her chair away, toward the window, where snow carried whispers she alone seemed to understand. "Give her time," they said. "Time and medication." George dismissed them one by one, his voice growing colder with every failed attempt. He refused to send his daughter to a psychiatric facility, as some recommended. If there is any light left in her, he thought, it is in that room. And I will not let them extinguish it with white walls and locks. By day, the mansion bustled with routine. Maids polishing stair rails, the cook clattering in the kitchen, security men murmuring into earpieces. But the rhythm was mechanical, soulless, as though the house itself knew laughter had departed. By night, the emptiness grew sharper. The staff retreated to their quarters, the fireplaces dimmed. Snow pressed its silence against every wall, and still that second-floor light burned on. A mute sentinel, a wound that refused to heal. George often sat in his study during these hours, a tumbler of whiskey untouched at his side. Above the mantel hung Evelyn's portrait. The artist had caught her in one of her rare, still moments, eyes lowered over a book, lips curved with a half-smile. In those painted eyes, George sometimes saw tenderness. Other nights, accusation. He would replay, again and again, their final conversation. Evelyn had called from the airport, voice tight with disappointment. "You're missing it again, George. Another weekend. Another promise broken." "I'll make it up to you. This contract—" Her sigh was the last sound he remembered clearly. Hours later, the phone rang again, but it was not Evelyn. It was the police. Since then, guilt had nested in him like an iron weight. He had conquered markets, bent empires to his will, but in his most human role, husband, father, he had failed irreparably. Clara's room had become the mansion's quiet legend. No servant dared speak of it openly. They left trays of food at the threshold, soup, bread, an apple. In the morning, sometimes the apple remained untouched, cold and glossy. Sometimes the bread bore a small bite. These faint signs became, for George, proof that his daughter still tethered herself to the living. Once he lingered outside her door, hand raised to knock. He lowered it. What words could he say? "I love you?" The phrase felt foreign in his mouth, heavy with years of absence. Business had taught him contracts, mergers, risks, but not the language of comfort. He stepped away, ashamed. The staff whispered among themselves. Mrs. Farnsworth, the stern housekeeper, shook her head. The child must be taken to specialists. The chauffeur muttered, "She's lost, poor thing. She'll never speak again." Even the nurses who rotated shifts outside her room confessed they had never heard a sound, yet the light glowed faithfully. Every dusk, it flicked on. Every dawn, it flicked off. No one knew what Clara did inside. Some said she drew for hours, filling her sketchbooks with shadows. Others imagined her staring endlessly through the glass at the bare trees. Whatever she did, it was done in silence. For George, each day outside that room was an education in helplessness. In business, he had known the thrill of discovery, the elegance of numbers. Equations had clarity. Theories had proofs. But here was an equation with no solution. A door he could not open. A daughter he could not reach. He began to dream of Evelyn at night, her laughter in the garden, her voice reading aloud from a book of poetry, her hair lifting in the wind. Each time he reached for her, she receded, like a shoreline slipping from a drowning man. When he woke, he walked the halls of his mansion and thought, "I built this empire for them. And now it is nothing but a mausoleum." Winter deepened. Storm after storm buried the drive in white silence. The staff cleared paths, lit fires, set the table for meals few enjoyed. George spent more evenings in his study, listening to the crackle of logs, staring at Evelyn's portrait. And always, when his eyes lifted to the second floor, that golden square of light burned like a silent question. Would Clara ever laugh again? The Halden household had more staff than most small hotels. Housekeepers in crisp uniforms, gardeners in green coats, chauffeurs with caps tucked low. Each one carried themselves with the stiff caution of those who served the wealthy. They moved quietly, never lingering, never speaking unless spoken to. Among them was one woman few noticed, Lucinda Brooks. She was 28, tall but slight, her skin the deep brown of Alabama soil, her voice rarely raised above a murmur. She wore the same gray uniform as the others, but while others conversed in whispers or sighed over chores, Lucinda kept to silence. To most of the staff, she was simply the quiet maid. She swept the marble floors, changed linens, polished silverware. She left little trace, like a shadow crossing the hall. Yet behind her quietness lay a life that none of them could have imagined. Lucinda had grown up far from New York, in a forgotten corner of Alabama where the soil cracked in summer and the cotton fields no longer yielded enough to feed those who worked them. Her mother cleaned schools for a living. Her father had disappeared when she was 5. As a girl, Lucinda spent afternoons waiting for her mother outside the local elementary school. She could not afford books or lessons, but she discovered something. If she pressed her ear to the cracked window pane, she could hear the teachers inside. She memorized entire lessons this way, multiplication tables, history dates, even passages of literature. One day, while sweeping floors after the last bell, she overheard a teacher reading from Homer's Odyssey. She did not know Greek, but the translation struck her like lightning. "Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways." The rhythm lodged in her mind. That night she repeated it over and over until the lines etched themselves into her memory. It became her gift, her secret, an almost perfect recall. Words clung to her like seeds to cloth. A poem heard once remained with her for years. A story, recited in fragments, could be reassembled whole. She had no library but her memory, and in a world of poverty, memory was the only treasure she carried. Life did not bend kindly toward her. By 16, she worked in diners, scrubbing dishes until her hands cracked. At 18, she tried to apply for college, but fees, forms, and the absence of a birth certificate blocked every attempt. She folded the dream quietly, like a paper she could not mail. When her mother died, Lucinda left Alabama with nothing but a suitcase and the storehouse of words in her head. She drifted north, finding jobs where she could, laundry rooms, motels, kitchens, until one winter she was hired at the Halden estate. The mansion overwhelmed her at first, its corridors long as railway tracks, its chandeliers glittering like cold stars. But she learned the rhythms quickly. She rose before dawn, polished the banisters, scrubbed the stone floors until they gleamed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Farnsworth, appreciated her diligence. "Quiet girl," she muttered. "Knows her place." Yet Lucinda carried a secret habit. While dusting shelves or wiping windows, she whispered lines of poetry under her breath, not loudly enough for others to hear, but enough that the syllables comforted her. Sometimes it was Emily Dickinson. "Hope is the thing with feathers." Sometimes Shakespeare, memorized from scraps she had once read in discarded textbooks. "We are such stuff as dreams are made on." Sometimes, when loneliness pressed heavy, she recited the old stories, Penelope weaving her endless tapestry, Antigone defying a king, Tom Sawyer dreaming of the river. For Lucinda, these whispers were not performance, but survival. They were the fire she carried within, the small proof that she was more than a servant's uniform. In the Halden house, she noticed Clara before anyone realized she was noticing. Each day, Lucinda carried trays up the staircase, placed them carefully before the locked door, and descended. She never heard a reply. Only once, when she bent to pick up an untouched apple, she thought she heard faint scratching inside, like a pencil across paper. Lucinda lingered a moment longer than necessary. Then she whispered, almost to herself, a line from Dickinson. "This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me." She did not know that behind the door a pair of young ears caught the sound. The other staff did not question her silences. To them she was useful precisely because she spoke little. In a household where whispers became gossip, Lucinda's quiet was a shield. But silence can also draw attention in unexpected ways. One evening, as she dusted the grand library, Mr. Halden himself entered. He rarely addressed the maids directly. This time he paused, watching her polish the wood of his wife's old desk. "You've been here how long?" he asked. His voice was low, clipped, the tone of a man used to receiving data. 2 years, sir," Lucinda answered, eyes lowered. "You don't speak much." "No, sir." "That's good." He moved on. For George Halden, silence in a servant was reassurance. He did not know that silence also hid a memory brimming with stories his daughter might one day need. At night, in her small attic room, Lucinda lay awake beneath the sloping roof. She owned almost nothing: a Bible with frayed edges, a notebook filled with lines she scribbled from memory, and a small box of keepsakes from Alabama. Yet in her mind, she held libraries: Homer, Shakespeare, Dickinson, Whitman. She whispered them into the dark like prayers. She thought often of the little girl behind the locked door. She had never seen Clara's face, only the faint shadows when the light spilled under the doorframe. But she felt an ache, a recognition. A child alone with silence is like a field without rain, she thought. If no word reaches her, she will wither. Lucinda did not dare imagine that one day her whispers might be heard, or that her hidden gift might bridge the abyss in that house. For now, she remained what she had always been, the maid who stayed silent. And yet, as the snow deepened outside and winter nights grew longer, silence itself was preparing to be broken. The winter deepened. Snow piled against the windowsills, muffling even the occasional rumble of passing cars on the distant road. Inside the Halden mansion, time seemed to have slowed into a single continuous evening. Days came and went, but nothing changed. The yellow glow of Clara's room lit at dusk, extinguished at dawn, while silence guarded the hours in between. Lucinda continued her routine. She polished the silver, swept the marble floors, carried trays upstairs. Each evening she left supper at the locked door, soup steaming faintly, bread still warm, an apple bright against the porcelain plate. Each morning she collected the tray, half-touched or untouched. The ritual was clockwork, as predictable as the cycles of the moon. Yet Lucinda had grown more attuned to subtleties. Some mornings she found the bread crusts stacked neatly, as though Clara had arranged them like bricks. Other mornings, a piece of apple carved into a shape almost like a crescent moon. Signs of life, signs of mind. A child's quiet rebellion against disappearance. It happened one night almost by accident. Lucinda was tired, bone-tired, from polishing the endless banisters. As she climbed the stairs with the supper tray, she hummed under her breath to keep herself awake. The tune was not quite a melody, more a chant she remembered from her teenage years when she had memorized fragments of Homer. The words slipped out before she realized she was speaking them. Sing to me, O Muse, of the man of many ways. She froze halfway through the line. Her heart beat fast. The words felt dangerous here, like fire struck in a dark barn. Quickly, she set the tray down at the door, bowed her head as if no one were watching, and turned to leave. But then, she heard it. The faintest rustle. Not the usual sound of dishes being moved. Something lighter, a chair scraping gently. Lucinda's breath caught. She turned her head slightly, listening. The silence stretched long. Perhaps she had imagined it. She began to descend the stairs. Behind the locked door, Clara sat upright. For months she had drawn in silence, filling her sketchbook with lines that no one would ever see. That night, the strange sound caught her. Words she had never heard spoken in that house. Muse, man of many ways. The rhythm tugged at her, like a hand brushing her shoulder. She raised her head for the first time in weeks, eyes narrowing as if to chase the voice through the wooden door. On the desk before her lay a half-finished drawing of a river. She touched the pencil to paper and sketched a small boat adrift. A single sail. A tiny figure. Something inside her chest shifted, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, but a quiver, like ice cracking over water. The following evening, Lucinda approached the door again. She did not mean to risk it, but when she set down the tray, the words slipped out, softer this time. Driven time and again off course. Once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. This time the rustle was unmistakable. The sound of paper turning. Lucinda's hand trembled as she placed the spoon. She dared not linger. But before leaving, she slid a small scrap of paper beneath the tray. On it, she had written, in her careful script, Penelope waited, weaving by day and unweaving by night. She walked away quickly, her heart hammering. It was reckless. If the housekeeper found out, if Mr. Halden discovered her crossing boundaries, she would be dismissed. And yet, something urged her forward. The thought of the silent child alone with her shadows was unbearable. Morning came. When Lucinda returned for the tray, the paper was gone. In its place lay another scrap, folded. She hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting was uneven, cramped, but unmistakably a child's. Why did she wait? Lucinda pressed the note to her chest, tears rising unbidden. For the first time since she had entered this mansion, she felt seen. Not by the masters of the house, but by the child within its locked heart. From that night forward, a secret class began. Lucinda never entered the room, never crossed the threshold. She did not dare. But each evening she whispered fragments of story as she set down the tray. Sometimes it was Homer, sometimes Shakespeare. She told of Hamlet pacing in the dark halls of Elsinore, of Antigone standing unbowed before a tyrant, of Huck Finn drifting down the river. She kept her voice low, a murmur almost swallowed by the thick carpet. To anyone passing by, it would sound like a servant muttering to herself. But Clara listened. She sat at her desk, sketchbook open, capturing in quick strokes the figures she heard: a prince with a skull, a girl before a throne, a boy in a raft beneath stars. Each morning, Lucinda would find a slip of paper in return. Was Hamlet truly mad? Why did Antigone disobey? Did Huck ever go home? The handwriting grew surer, the questions bolder. Clara's silence remained, but her mind was stirring, reaching out. One evening, Lucinda dared to let her voice rise above a whisper. She read lines from Shakespeare's The Tempest. "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." For the first time, a sound escaped the locked room. It was not laughter, not yet, but a faint, audible breath, a soft exhale that almost resembled wonder. Lucinda closed her eyes, steadying herself. She whispered one last line. "Good night, sweet child. May the stories keep you company." Then she descended the staircase, her heart alight with both fear and hope. That night, George Halden, working late in his study, paused. He thought he heard something impossible, a soft rustle of movement. Then, was it a sigh? He rose, but by the time he reached the hall, the house was silent again. He shook his head, convincing himself it was the wind. Yet a part of him wondered, had the locked room stirred at last? Inside the room, Clara sat with her sketchbook. She had drawn the boat again, but this time, on the shore, a woman stood waiting. She had woven and unwoven all night long. Clara looked at the figure and, for the first time since her mother's death, felt the corner of her lips twitch upward. Not a laugh, but the first glimpse of a smile. The Halden mansion had never known such quiet electricity. For months, silence had been a weight pressing upon every corridor, suffocating even the sound of footsteps. But now something invisible stirred. The change was delicate, fragile as the first bud-piercing snow, but it was there. Clara's locked room was no longer a tomb of silence. It had become a listening chamber. Each evening, as the supper tray arrived, she placed down her pencil and waited, ear tilted, eyes sharpened. She listened not for her father's voice, nor the nurses, nor the cold instructions of therapists. She listened for her, for the maid's low voice, whispering ancient stories as if carrying embers through the night. Lucinda had not planned for any of this. She had sworn to herself never to cross boundaries, never to draw the gaze of her employers. A maid survived by being invisible. Yet the note Clara had left, why did she wait? Burned in Lucinda's pocket like a living coal. The following evening, when she set down the tray, she answered with words whispered through the wood. Penelope waited because love gives her strength. She believed that even across oceans, her thread was tied to Odysseus. She slipped another scrap of paper beneath the tray. Written in her neat script, "Some waits are proof of love." The next morning, she found Clara's reply. "But what if he never comes back?" Lucinda pressed her lips together, the question piercing more deeply than she expected. She carried the tray downstairs, but all day long, as she scrubbed and polished, she turned the words over like stones in her hands. That night she whispered again, "Then love becomes its own story." Penelope still lived, still breathed, still dreamed. Waiting shaped her into someone strong enough to stand alone. Thus began their secret exchange, half whispers, half ink. Lucinda recalled more and more stories from the library of her memory. She spoke of Antigone defying a king for the sake of her brother. She told of Hamlet questioning the meaning of life, of Juliet daring to love against the will of her family. She remembered every word with uncanny precision, as if the books themselves lived within her. Clara listened as if drinking water after drought. Each tale was a lantern hung in her dark room. She no longer drew only rivers and boats. Now she sketched crowns, veils, masks, swords, stars. Characters came alive in pencil lines. Hamlet with a haunted face, Antigone with a steady gaze, Juliet leaning toward a balcony. In the mornings, Lucinda found her questions waiting. Why did Hamlet not act? Was Antigone wrong to defy the law? Could Juliet have lived if she waited longer? Each question was a spark, and each answer Lucinda offered, sometimes whispered at the door, sometimes scribbled on scraps, was fuel for the flame. One evening, Lucinda chose not a tragedy but a lighter tale. She recalled Twain's adventures of Tom Sawyer, the boy painting fences and tricking others into helping. As she told it, her voice carried faint amusement. Behind the door, Clara's lips curved. She caught herself in the act, surprised. The smile was small, but it stayed as she sketched a boy with messy hair and mischief in his eyes. For the first time, her pencil moved not out of grief, but delight. That morning, the slip of paper carried a single word, underlined twice. Funny. Lucinda read it again and again until her eyes blurred. She carried the note against her chest as if it were a medal. The mansion staff remained unaware. To them, Clara's room was still a place of silence. They did not see the faint shift in her drawings, nor the brightness that returned, drop by drop. George Halden noticed something subtle, though he did not yet name it. He found that trays came back emptier, soup bowls scraped clean. Once, passing the hallway, he thought he saw a flicker of movement at the curtain, small fingers perhaps adjusting the edge. He told himself not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Yet deep inside, he felt a quiver he had not felt in months. Lucinda's attic room grew cluttered with Clara's notes. She saved every scrap, even the shortest. 3 words, a question mark, a crooked doodle. She stored them in a small wooden box under her bed, like relics of a fragile miracle. Sometimes she wept silently over them. This child is alive. She is still reaching. And I, of all people, am the one she reaches toward. Weeks passed, and the secret lessons deepened. Lucinda introduced Clara to poetry. She spoke softly of Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all. The next morning, Clara's note read, "Did the bird sing for her too?" Lucinda answered simply, "Yes, always." The ritual became the rhythm of both their lives. Clara waited each night, Lucinda whispered. The exchange continued. No contract was signed, no syllabus written, yet a class had formed more powerful than any taught in polished schools. It was not knowledge alone that bound them. It was the sense for Clara that she was not alone with her grief, and for Lucinda that her long-buried gift was finally feeding another soul. One evening, as Lucinda whispered lines from Hamlet, something extraordinary happened. She paused, waiting for the usual silence. Then, from behind the door, she heard it, the faint scratch of chalk on a slate. She frowned, confused. But when she returned in the morning, she found a slip of paper different from the rest. It bore not words, but a drawing. The drawing showed two figures. One stood at a closed door, speaking. The other sat inside, listening, her face tilted toward the sound. Between them was a line, thin but unbroken, connecting their hearts. Lucinda pressed the paper to her lips, whispering a prayer she had not spoken since childhood. And so, in the heart of winter, in a house built with money but starved of joy, a hidden classroom bloomed. No chalkboards, no desks, no degrees, only memory, paper, and the courage to whisper. And beyond the locked door, for the first time since tragedy struck, Clara began to believe that stories could stitch the torn fabric of her world. The change came so gradually that George almost missed it. For months, Clara's room had been a monument to silence. Now, subtle signs began to ripple through the mansion. A tray returned not half-eaten, but emptied. A nurse, astonished, reported that Clara had taken a glass of water from her hand without turning away. One morning, George noticed faint marks on the frost of Clara's window, tiny fingerprints where she had drawn back the curtain to glimpse the snow. They were details so small most would have overlooked them. But for George, each was a shockwave. He had lived so long in despair that any flicker of change felt impossible, almost dangerous. One evening, he returned late from Manhattan. The meeting had been a blur, charts, analysts, voices competing. He had nodded at the right places, signed where required, but his mind had been elsewhere, at home, on that second floor, on the stubborn light that refused to extinguish his hope. As he entered the mansion, he heard it. A sound so foreign it made him stop mid-step. It was not music, not words, but something lighter, quicker. A stifled breath that carried the shape of laughter. He froze in the hallway, pulse hammering. For a man who had once calculated billions with cool certainty, he now stood trembling at a whisper of sound. He turned his head slowly toward the staircase. The sound had come from above, from Clara's room. He climbed the steps as silently as a man his age could manage. The closer he came, the more certain he grew. There were voices. One low, warm, unmistakably the maid's, the other higher, sharper, breaking in fits. Clara's. Not speech, not yet, but the gasp of a child trying to swallow a smile. George stopped outside the door. He pressed his hand against the polished wood. For the first time in more than a year, he felt life vibrating beyond it. Inside, Lucinda was telling Clara about Tom Sawyer painting the fence. She used her hands, gesturing even though no one could see her. She made her voice quick and sly when Tom tricked the other boys, then high-pitched and sulky when the boys begged to take over. Clara sat at her desk, sketching furiously. She drew the fence, the bucket, the grinning boy leaning against it. The lines shook as she stifled a laugh. She clamped her hand over her mouth, eyes wide, as if laughter itself might break the fragile spell. Yet the smile refused to vanish. Lucinda paused mid-story, startled. Had she really heard it? That tiny, broken laugh? Her throat tightened. She leaned closer to the door and finished the tale softly, her own voice trembling with wonder. George stayed there a long time, his hand against the wood, listening. He did not push the door open. He did not reveal himself. When at last he returned to his study, he poured a drink but did not touch it. His hands shook too much. Instead, he stared at Evelyn's portrait. She laughed, he whispered. His voice cracked like old wood. She laughed, Evie. The next day, George observed more closely. Clara's footsteps, faint but steady, moved around her room. A soft humming, barely audible, seemed to drift through the keyhole. Once, as he passed, he saw the corner of a paper slip out beneath the door as though dropped hastily. He stooped, but before he could pick it up, Lucinda appeared at the end of the hall, carrying her tray. Their eyes met. George straightened slowly, the note forgotten. Something in the maid's expression unsettled him. Not guilt, exactly, but an intensity he did not understand. Suspicion rooted itself in his mind. That evening, he returned earlier than usual and sat alone in the library. He left the door cracked just enough to hear footsteps. At 8 o'clock he heard them. Lucinda's steady tread up the staircase, the soft clink of a tray set down. Then, silence. Then, a voice. Lucinda's. Quiet, but steady. Reciting words. Not instructions. Not chatter. Lines, measured and ancient. George frowned, rising silently from his chair. He moved to the staircase, each step deliberate. He stood in the shadows of the hall, listening. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me. It was Shakespeare. Hamlet, spoken by a maid in a gray uniform outside the locked door of his daughter's room. And from within, he heard the scratch of pencil, the rustle of paper, and once, impossibly, a stifled laugh. He clenched his fists. Was this maid defying his authority, planting strange ideas in his child's head? Or was she the reason Clara stirred at all? He did not know which thought frightened him more. That night, George summoned Mrs. Farnsworth. "This maid, Lucinda, how long has she been with us?" 2 years, sir," the housekeeper replied, her tone clipped. "And you've noticed nothing unusual?" "She keeps her head down. Quiet girl, knows her place." "Does she?" George muttered. More to himself than to her. After the housekeeper left, he paced the study. He wanted to storm upstairs, to forbid the maid from speaking another word. Yet the memory of Clara's laugh, thin, fleeting but real, echoed louder than his anger. He stood before Evelyn's portrait again. "What would you have me do?" he whispered. The painted smile, as always, offered no answer. The following evening, George could not resist. He climbed the stairs softly, approaching the door. He positioned himself just out of sight. Lucinda's voice drifted through. Tonight it was Homer again. The tale of Odysseus blinded but unbroken. She recited with clarity, every syllable precise, and then he heard it. Clara's laugh. Not stifled this time. Clearer, brighter. A sound so rare George almost wept where he stood. He pressed his hand against the wall, steadying himself. It was true. His daughter was alive inside that silence. But the knowledge twisted him. If a maid could reach Clara, what did that make of him? The father, the billionaire, the man who had built empires but could not mend his own child. Suspicion became a thorn in his heart. Gratitude tangled with fear, awe laced with doubt. Who was this woman who carried entire libraries in her memory? Why had fate placed her here, in his house, before his daughter's locked door? George did not yet have answers, but he knew one thing with terrible clarity. The silence had been broken, and with it, the balance of his house would never be the same again. George Halden had made his fortune by mastering confrontation. In boardrooms, he faced down rivals with the calm of a chess master. In negotiations, he stripped opponents of illusions until they surrendered. He believed confrontation was simply another word for truth revealed. But tonight, as he paced his study, The thought of confronting a maid unsettled him in ways hostile billionaires never had. Lucinda had crossed a line. That much was clear. She was not hired to instruct, to recite, to plant words into the mind of his child. Yet, Clara was changing. Clara was stirring. Clara had laughed. And so George's heart twisted in two directions, one part furious, one part grateful. He poured whiskey into a glass and let it sit untouched, his reflection trembling in the amber liquid. Evelyn's portrait watched from above the mantel. He spoke to it as if to her. She's overstepping. She's meddling. But Evie, Clara laughed. For the first time in a year, she laughed. The silence of the painted room gave no answer. The next morning, George sent for Lucinda. She entered the study with careful steps, wiping her hands against the hem of her uniform. The fire behind him cast long shadows across the walls. "You asked for me, sir?" Her voice was calm, though her fingers clenched at her side. George remained seated, elbows on the desk, hands steepled. He studied her as if she were a ledger he could decipher. "You've been speaking to my daughter," he said at last. Lucinda's breath caught, but she did not lower her eyes. "Yes, sir." "You were not hired to speak. You were hired to clean, to serve." His voice was low, precise, the voice of a man used to obedience. "I know, sir." "Then why?" His words cut sharp. "Why insert yourself into matters that do not concern you? Do you imagine yourself her tutor, her physician, her savior?" Lucinda swallowed. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. "No, sir. I don't imagine myself any of those. I am only a voice. Nothing more." George narrowed his eyes. "And what gives you the right to offer that voice?" Lucinda's answer was so quiet it almost disappeared. "Because she needed it." For a long moment, the room held only the ticking of the clock. George leaned back in his chair. He had expected excuses, apologies, maybe tears. Instead, the maid stood steady before him, shoulders squared, voice plain. "You presume much," he said. Lucinda met his gaze. "With respect, sir, I presume nothing. I only know what I see. She does not need more pills. She does not need more silence. She needs to remember she is not alone. Stories remind her. They give her company." Her voice trembled now, but with urgency rather than fear. "When a child is drowning, sir, you don't stop to ask if you're allowed to throw a rope." George rose to his feet. He was taller, his presence formidable, the weight of authority pressing down like a gavel. "You risk your position. You risk your livelihood." Lucinda's chin lifted slightly. "Some things are worth the risk." Her words struck him harder than he expected. For a moment he saw Evelyn in the way Lucinda stood, unbowed, quiet, but firm. Evelyn had spoken like that once, years ago, when she had accused him of choosing empire over family. George turned away, pacing to the window. Snow drifted lazily outside. His breath fogged the glass. "Do you know," he said slowly, "how many experts I've brought into this house? Men and women with degrees, awards, reputations. None of them reached her. None." His voice hardened. "And now, you, a maid, claim to do what they could not." "I claim nothing, sir," Lucinda said softly. "I only—" "Listen." "And I remember." He turned back sharply. "Remember." "Yes." Her eyes brightened with a quiet flame. "I remember stories, lines, words that once carried me through nights when I had nothing else. I kept them alive in me. And when I saw your daughter fading into silence, I thought, maybe they could keep her alive, too. George studied her. The sincerity in her face unsettled him. This was not manipulation, this was conviction. Still, suspicion coiled in him. And what do you expect in return? Gratitude? Reward? To climb above your station? Lucinda flinched at the harshness but steadied herself. No, sir, I expect nothing. I cannot stand by while a child sinks into darkness. If that costs me my place here, then so be it. The words landed heavy. For a man who had spent his life calculating profit and loss, here was a statement beyond calculation. She would risk her survival, her only livelihood, for the chance that Clara might smile again. George sat down heavily. For the first time in years, he felt unsure. The fire crackled. At last he spoke. Quieter. Last night, I heard her laugh. Lucinda's eyes widened. She pressed her hand briefly to her lips. Then she is beginning to return. George nodded once, slowly. He wanted to ask how. He wanted to ask why. But pride locked the words in his throat. Instead, he muttered, You will not speak of this to anyone. Not the housekeeper. Not the staff. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Lucinda replied. He looked at her again, longer this time. Go, he said finally. She bowed her head and left the room, her steps light but her heart hammering. When the door closed, George remained at his desk. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the glass of whiskey. He lifted it, then set it down untouched. Evelyn's portrait loomed above him, her painted eyes calm, knowing. What are you seeing that I cannot? He whispered. What have I overlooked? But the canvas, as always, gave no answer. That night, George lingered near the staircase, hidden in shadows, listening. Once again, he heard Lucinda's voice at the door, weaving words older than nations. And once again, faint but unmistakable, Clara's laughter answered. George pressed his hand against the railing. Suspicion remained sharp as a thorn, but now it was tangled with something more dangerous than doubt. Hope. The shift from winter to spring came almost unnoticed in the Halden estate. Snow receded in sluggish patches, leaving behind damp soil and brittle grass. But inside the mansion, the seasons mattered little. Time was measured not by the thawing earth, but by the fragile rhythm of Clara's recovery. For weeks, she had shown signs of life. Notes slipped under the door grew longer, questions sharper. Sometimes George heard the faint sound of humming, as though Clara were echoing Lucinda's words. For the first time in a year, he felt the ache of hope rising in his chest. But recovery is never a straight line. Healing curves back on itself, fragile as glass. And so, the breaking point came. It began one morning when a new tutor was announced. George, pressed by the advice of colleagues and the insistence of doctors, reluctantly agreed to try again. He had delayed for months, but the pressure mounted. A child cannot grow on stories alone. She must return to lessons, to structure, to the world. The tutor, a thin man with spectacles and the polished manner of academia, arrived with briefcase in hand. His voice was gentle but precise, rehearsed from years of classrooms. I'll be patient, he promised. When Clara heard the news, she did not cry. She did not speak. She only sat at her desk, the pencil suspended above paper, her eyes wide and distant. Then, quietly, she tore the page into strips. By evening, Lucinda found the supper tray overturned. Soup spilled like blood across the carpet. Bread shredded into crumbs. The apple smashed against the wall. Inside the room, Clara had erupted. She ripped drawings from her sketchbook, shredding them into a storm of paper. Her small hands trembled as she slashed with scissors, cutting through sketches of boats, crowns, and faces. She tore down curtains, clawed at the carpet, screamed into her pillow until her throat burned. The staff gathered helplessly outside. Mrs. Farnsworth clucked her tongue. "She's relapsing. I told you this would happen." The nurse wrung her hands, murmuring about sedatives. George arrived, white-faced, eyes blazing with fear. He gripped the doorknob, but Clara had locked it from the inside. He pounded once, twice. "Clara, it's your father! Open the door!" His voice cracked. Silence answered, followed by the sound of something breaking, a lamp, perhaps. He turned to the staff, his composure unraveling. "Get it open, now!" But Lucinda stepped forward. "Sir," she said softly, "let me try." George whirled on her. "This is no time." "She'll hear me," Lucinda insisted. Her voice was calm, steady, though her heart thundered. "She'll not hear anyone else, please." For a long moment, George glared at her. Authority warred with desperation. At last, he stepped back. Lucinda approached the door. She laid her palm flat against the wood, as though feeling the heat of Clara's rage through it. "Clara," she said gently, "I'm here." No answer, only the sound of drawers slamming. Lucinda closed her eyes. Then she began to speak, not as a maid, but as a storyteller. "Once, there was a girl named Psyche. She lived in darkness, away from the world. She longed to see the face of the one she loved, but when she dared, everything shattered. She was left alone, wandering through night and sorrow." The noise inside faltered. Lucinda continued. Psyche was given impossible tasks. She had to sort mountains of seeds, fetch golden wool from wild rams, descend even into the underworld. Alone, she could never have done it, but each time something small helped her. An ant, a reed, a tower whispering advice. She discovered she was not truly alone. Lucinda's voice grew softer, richer, carrying through the crack beneath the door. And so, Psyche walked through shadows. She carried a box of night itself, heavy with despair. But in the end, her courage led her back to love, back to light. Inside, Clara had sunk to the floor among shreds of paper. Her small chest heaved, her hands trembled, but as Lucinda's words drifted through, she lifted her head. The image formed in her mind. Psyche, stumbling through darkness, carrying a box heavier than her strength. Tears burst suddenly from her eyes. She crawled to the door, pressed her forehead against it, and sobbed, loud, broken sobs, the first sound of grief released after endless silence. Lucinda pressed her own head to the wood. "It's all right, child. It's all right." Even Psyche wept. Even she thought she could not go on. But she did. And so will you. The sobbing grew louder, wilder. Then, a click. The lock turned. The door creaked open. Clara stood there, small and trembling, hair tangled, cheeks wet. For a long second she stared at Lucinda as though seeing her for the first time. Then, with a cry, she fell into her arms. Lucinda caught her, kneeling, cradling the thin body against her chest. Clara buried her face in Lucinda's shoulder, clutching at her as though drowning. Lucinda stroked her hair, murmuring fragments of story between the girl's sobs. George stood frozen in the hallway, his face ashen. He had never seen his daughter like this, broken, weeping, but alive, desperately alive. He took a step forward, but Clara clung tighter to Lucinda, refusing to release her. For the first time in his life, George Halden understood. His daughter had chosen someone else's arms over his. The staff dispersed quietly. unsettled by the scene. Only George remained, standing helplessly as his daughter wept herself empty. At last, Clara's sobs subsided into hiccups. She fell asleep against Lucinda's chest, drained. Lucinda carried her gently to the bed, tucked her beneath blankets, and sat beside her, humming softly until the child's breathing steadied. When she rose, George was still there, watching. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between gratitude, fury, and grief. "You," he said hoarsely, "were the only one she opened to." Lucinda lowered her eyes. "She needed a story, sir. That is all." George's voice broke. "No, she needed her mother." He turned away sharply, hiding his face. That night, the mansion did not sleep. George remained in his study until dawn, pacing, haunted by what he had seen. Evelyn's portrait seemed to gaze more sternly than ever. And in the small bed upstairs, Clara slept for the first time in months without nightmares, her hand curled around a scrap of paper on which Lucinda had written a single line. Even in the underworld, Psyche found her way back to the light. Morning crept gently into the Halden house. Clara still slept, her breathing steady, one hand curled around the scrap of paper Lucinda had given her. Even in the underworld, Psyche found her way back to the light. George stood in the doorway, unable to step inside at first. He saw Lucinda sitting quietly beside the bed, like a sentinel of warmth. His daughter, once so untouchable, now leaned into another's care. The sight pierced him, yet it also soothed. "What did you say to her?" he whispered. "A story," Lucinda answered simply, "of a girl who carried her darkness until courage and help led her back." George's eyes wandered to the nightstand. There lay Evelyn's old anthology of poems. He had not noticed it in years. "Read to me," he said, surprising himself. Lucinda opened it but barely glanced at the page. She recited softly, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul." Her memory was flawless, her voice gentle. George felt time bend. Evelyn had once spoken the same lines on a summer porch. He swallowed hard. "You remember all of it." "I remember because I had nothing else," Lucinda said, "and because remembering saved me." George studied her. He was a man who bought knowledge with money, yet here stood a woman who carried whole libraries within her, asking nothing. Clara stirred then, half awake. She looked at both of them and, for the first time, let a word slip from her lips. "Again." The sound was fragile, but real. Lucinda smiled. George nearly broke down. "Again," he whispered back, and together they repeated the poem, line by line, while the child traced words on her quilt with a finger. Later in the library, George spoke low, almost ashamed. "You've done more for her than anyone. I don't understand it, but I see it." Lucinda bowed her head. "It isn't me, sir. It's the stories. They are doors. She chose to walk through." He nodded slowly. For a man who had spent his life in numbers, this was the first equation he could not control but finally believed in. That evening, he sat outside Clara's room as Lucinda told the Odyssey. And when he heard his daughter laugh, a bright, brief sound, he closed his eyes and let it wash over him like absolution. Recognition had come at last. That healing does not always wear the face we expect, and that sometimes wisdom is hidden in the quietest servant of the house. George Halden had never been a man to ask about the lives of those who served him. He knew the names on payroll sheets, not the stories behind them. But after Clara's first real laugh, after the word "again" spoken like a fragile seed, he found himself compelled. Who was this woman who had reached his daughter where doctors and tutors failed? One evening, after Clara had drifted to sleep, George asked Lucinda to join him in the library. They sat not across a desk, but near the fire, where the shadows softened authority. "Tell me," he said quietly, "where did you learn all this? The poems, the plays, you recite them as if they are carved inside you." Lucinda hesitated, hands folded in her lap. "I never went to college, sir. My mother cleaned schools in Alabama. I used to wait for her outside, and when I could, I pressed my ear against the windows. I memorized the lessons through the glass." George's brows lifted. "Through the glass?" She nodded. "That's how I learned multiplication, history, Homer, Shakespeare. Words stuck to me. I didn't know why, only that I could not forget them. Later I dreamed of teaching, but—" She shrugged gently. "Dreams cost money. My mother fell ill. I cleaned instead of studying. After she passed, I drifted north. I found work where I could, and here I am." The fire popped softly. George leaned back, silent for a long while. The story struck him like a parable. A girl gathering knowledge from windows she was not allowed to enter, carrying it not in books, but in memory. At last he said, "Do you understand what you've done? You've given my daughter back her voice. You've built her a bridge out of grief, without a degree, without permission. That is no small gift." Lucinda lowered her gaze. "I only gave what I had." George's throat tightened. All his life he had measured worth by credentials, by titles, by wealth. But before him sat a woman with none of those, yet who had become, for Clara, both mother and teacher. When word spread through the household that Mr. Halden had begun inviting the maid into the library, whispers rose. Mrs. Farnsworth warned him discreetly, "It is not proper, sir. She has no qualifications." George silenced her with a look colder than January frost. "I have seen her qualifications. They are written on my daughter's face." The following night, he did something he had never done. He asked Lucinda to sit with him and Clara together. They opened Evelyn's old anthology, the pages marked with penciled stars. George stumbled over a line, and Lucinda corrected gently. Clara giggled at his mistake. For the first time, father, daughter, and maid shared the same circle of light. George realized then that he could not keep Lucinda in the shadows. "From this day," he said, his voice trembling between command and plea, "you are no longer simply a maid in this house. You are Clara's teacher, her guide, her companion." Lucinda's eyes widened. "Sir, I have no certificate. No one will accept—" "I accept," George interrupted. "I saw my daughter nearly vanish. I see her alive again. That is evidence enough." Not everyone agreed. A cousin who visited later scoffed. "A maid as governess, you'll be mocked." George's reply was sharp. Better mocked with a laughing child than praised with a silent one. The words ended the discussion. That night, as Lucinda returned to her attic room, she pressed her hands over her face. The girl who once memorized scraps through a school window was now invited inside, trusted with the education of a billionaire's daughter. It felt like a dream too large to hold. But in the room below, Clara whispered into her quilt a word she now used often. Again. And for Lucinda, that was reason enough to keep teaching. Spring returned in earnest, and with it, a new rhythm to the Halden house. The locked room no longer held its legend of silence. Doors stood open now, light streamed in. The mansion, once an echo chamber of grief, carried the warmth of voices again. Clara changed first in the smallest ways. She wrote in her journal, short entries like, "Today I heard Juliet speak," or "Odysseus is still sailing." She began to draw not just in black pencil, but with color. Boats with red sails, birds with yellow wings, a girl standing tall with a torch in her hand. At meals, she sometimes sat at the table with her father. The first time, George could barely hold his fork steady. When Clara passed him the salt without being asked, he nearly wept. Lucinda, once only a quiet shadow in gray uniform, was now called Miss Brooks by George in front of the staff. She spent mornings guiding Clara through stories, afternoons helping her sketch or read aloud. Lessons were not about grammar or arithmetic, but about wonder, how a metaphor worked, how courage sounded in a line of verse, how grief could find release in a story. One evening, George joined them. He sat awkwardly at first, more observer than participant. But when Clara mispronounced a Greek name and giggled, George laughed too. The sound startled him. It had been absent from his own voice for so long. From then on, he joined often. They read Shakespeare together, each taking a role. Clara played Juliet, George an overly dramatic Romeo, and Lucinda, with a grin, the nurse. Their laughter rang down the hall, startling the staff, who had almost forgotten such sounds. The mansion itself seemed to shift. The cook began singing again while stirring soup. The gardener planted bright flowers near the gate. Even Mrs. Farnsworth, stern and disapproving, found herself pausing outside Clara's door to listen, softening despite herself. The locked room had become a classroom, and the classroom a hearth. George knew the world outside would question. Family, shareholders, society, they would all sneer at the thought of a maid turned teacher. But he no longer cared. He had seen what none of them had. His daughter alive again, her eyes bright, her laughter returned. No diploma could outweigh that. "You've given her back to me," he told Lucinda one evening by the fire. Lucinda shook her head. "She gave herself back, sir. Stories only lit the way." George studied her quietly. He realized then that gratitude was too small a word. Respect was better. Trust was best. Summer approached. Clara and Lucinda worked together on a project, retelling the stories in Clara's own words and pictures. Each page of the notebook held a sketch and a line of text: Odysseus steering, Antigone standing, Psyche carrying her box. George watched them one afternoon, bent together over the desk, and felt something settle in him. The sense of a family restored, not in the shape he once knew, but in a shape still beautiful. When the book was finished, Clara handed it to him. On the first page, she had written, "For Papa, for Miss Brooks, for Mama, who is still here in the stories." George closed the book against his chest, eyes stinging. That evening they sat by the great fireplace. Logs cracked, sparks leapt. Clara leaned against Lucinda's shoulder, her eyes heavy with sleep. George sat close, the book in his lap. Lucinda read softly from memory, her voice the steady flame. George listened, not as a man who commanded, but as one who finally understood the value of listening. Clara's eyelids closed, her lips curved faintly in dreams. For the first time since tragedy shattered his house, George felt whole. The silence had been broken, not by wealth or power, but by a servant's memory and a child's hunger for words. And in that breaking, healing had come. The firelight wrapped them all in a single glow. The maid, the child, the father. An unlikely family, bound by story, by grief, by love, renewed. The night settled gently around them. And the mansion, once a tomb, breathed again with life. Thank you for spending these quiet moments with this story. If it brought you even a little warmth, a smile, or a memory worth keeping, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. It helps these small fires of storytelling keep glowing, and I'd love to share many more with you.